Thank you, Tamar. And thank you out there in the audience for rejoining us, or if this is your first time. As Tamar already mentioned, we don't take it for granted that in these very, very difficult days we can carry on our basic social and cultural activities, and we certainly are praying for the safe return of all of our hostages and our soldiers, especially as we look toward the holiday of Pesach, the holiday of freedom. And in that connection, we are in fact discussing the civil rights movement and its era in the United States against the background of trying to achieve a new understanding of what freedom actually means. In the cover photo that I hope you see on your screens, there is a speaker at the microphone, Rabbi Joachim Prinz, appearing at the 1963 March on Washington event very soon, just before Martin Luther King Jr. was introduced to deliver his famous I Have a Dream address. And what we did in the first segment last week was to look at what was the background during the 1950s that led to the close involvement not only of Rabbi Prince, but other rabbis and Jewish community organizations in this build-up since 1954, certainly of the campaign to widen and equalize the civil rights of all Americans, and particularly Black Americans. And this interesting nexus that was created between some Jewish organizations, and particularly those national Jewish organizations, and parts, swaths of the American Jewish population across the country in terms of public opinion, although not necessarily all across the country. And as I mentioned last week, there certainly were perceptible differences between Jews living in the South, who very often felt it incumbent on them to conform to the norms of the society in which they were living. Between them and Jews in northern and western parts of the country who had a different perspective. And nevertheless, during the 50s and early 60s, the entire race question in the United States began to take on national rather than regional proportions. And it's at this point where we come back into the discussion today. By the time we get to 1963, we're already used to hearing about some major manifestations of cooperation between Jewish groups and civil rights activists in the Black community, and it wouldn't be long before the term Black-Jewish Alliance would come into play. People be reflecting back on those years, used that term quite often. And so one of the things that we'll be looking at today and asking ourselves is, well, what was this Black-Jewish Alliance and why did it persist into the 1960s, on the one hand, but also what caused this alliance, if it existed, what caused it to fade or weaken toward the end of that same decade? Was it a real alliance? Or was it an optical illusion? If it was a real alliance, was it a tactical alliance based on common interests? Or was it an alliance of values, a long-term strategic alliance that could persist beyond the 1960s? And these are very, very tough historical questions, and hopefully we'll try to clear up some of these issues today. Remaining questions I'll try to address next week. Now, one of the important reasons why people spoke of a black-Jewish alliance and thought of it as something fairly reasonable and normal was the fact that the declared goals of the civil rights movement in the 50s and the early 60s, the declared goals were integration and civic equality. And these goals were positions that many Jews in the United States believed that they personally had an important stake in the fulfillment and achievement of these goals. In the 1950s and 60s, just after the Second World War, the generation of Jews who had grown up between the two world wars and had themselves experienced forms of discrimination against Jews in various forms, in employment, in higher education, in places where they wanted to vacation, and those who were servicemen and women in the Second World War and experienced forms of popular anti-Semitism from the ranks in the units in which they served. All of these things added up to a sense in the 50s and 60s, certainly in the Jewish establishment, if we can use that word, these big Jewish organizations, some of which we referred to last time, the American Jewish Congress, the American Jewish Committee, and so on. There was still the sense in the 50s and 60s that integrating the Jews into American society remained a goal that needed to be achieved. In other words, the perception among Jews in particular was that this integration that they sought, or the equality at the social level that they sought, or that their parents had sought, had not yet come to full expression. And on that basis, on the basis that, well, yeah, Jews want to be integrated too, Jews want to feel equal too, that there was this idea that, yes, on the platform of integration and equality, Jews and other groups easily could have a meeting of the minds. I would add here that those researchers in the social sciences who in the 50s and 60s were writing about these issues of American society's minorities and how was the process of social accommodation or assimilation, how was it progressing in the 50s, and books that were still being published in the early 60s, Jews and blacks were often paired in the existing research literature as the two, quote, unassimilated minorities. That is to say, if other groups, Catholics of various ethnic origins and so on, were perceived to be melting in the proverbial American melting pot, the same could not really be said for Jews by virtue of their being the largest and most visible non-Christian minority in a society that defined itself, at least informally and in many cases quite formally, as a Christian society. So there were Jews who were an unassimilated minority by virtue of their religion, and there were African Americans who were another unassimilated minority by virtue of their skin color. And the whole complex of understandings that white Americans had about the question of race. And this idea that these two minorities were classic in the sense that they represented the hardcore problem in the attempt to assimilate different parts of a very diverse society into something approaching one national society, the idea that Jews and blacks shared a common position in that scale of difference was still being honored and indeed spoken about in the 50s and 60s. And this, as I say, helps us to understand why during those years, right through the early 60s, the idea that Jewish people and black people in the United States had many things in common, why there were some people, many people in fact, who believed that to be a very reasonable position to take. Now the irony, if you will, or the paradox, is that in fact, looking at any social measure that you could choose or economic measure, Jewish people and Black Americans were very, very far apart by the 1950s and 60s. By the post-war years, the great majority of the Jewish population in the United States had achieved middle-class status. However you want to define that, middle-class status meaning they were no longer, by and large, to be found employed in factory jobs. They enjoyed an income level that was superior than the national average. Their living standards were middle-class living standards, and so on. This was very, very different from the situation among African Americans, the population with the lowest average incomes in the United States at the time. Another parameter would be higher education and professionalization that often followed higher education. That was where Jews, especially of the younger generation, tended to excel, particularly after the end of the Second World War. And if we look at the other side of the coin, among Black Americans, we're dealing with a population that is still struggling with segregated schooling and with very, very limited access to a higher education. If we look at the area of the legal status of Jews as opposed to the legal status of Black citizens, we're dealing with Jim Crow in the South and beyond the South, where there were laws on the books that discriminated specifically against people of the Black minority. There were no laws on the books in any American state that discriminated against Jews. Any discrimination that took place against Jews tended to be at the social level in employment situations and so on, but never legalized. At the point that we're talking about, the late 50s, early 60s, both the Democratic and the Republican parties maintained a friendly disposition towards Jewish constituencies. They wooed Jewish voters in various ways. The situation of Black Americans was far more complicated, mainly because the Democratic Party, which in the North reflected this sort of coalition of urban ethnics and liberals and labor people, people who were the FDR coalition from the 1930s, in the South, the Solid South, as it was called, because of the monopoly of power exercised by the Democratic Party in the South, which was completely monopolized by white Southerners and gave no political access to Black citizens. The political situation of Black people, particularly in the South, but not just there, looked very, very different. They were not being wooed as voters. They were being blocked from voting. They were being blocked from registering to vote. And so forth. In other words, if every standard or every measure of what we might consider some sort of pecking order or status in American society, if you looked at the picture of where the Jews were in the 50s and 60s and the picture of where Black people were at the same time, these two groups actually did not stand anywhere in close proximity to each other. I would mention one other thing, and it's something that I'll also come back to next week. We said that in the 50s and 60s, Jews still appeared to be, and were even spoken of, as an unassimilated or even an unassimilable minority from the religious point of view. That was actually beginning to change and soften. We're dealing with the 1950s and 60s during the Cold War. A great deal of public discourse in the United States was devoted to this idea that Jews and Christian Americans shared something basic together. They shared what was being called, for the first time, the Judeo-Christian ethic. That is to say, Christianity, which up until the 1940s, generally speaking, referred to Judaism only as the religion that had been rejected and superseded by Christianity. By the time we get to the 1950s, the churches and interfaith groups and spokespeople for campaigns within the American public sphere were talking about a Judeo-Christian ethic as if it had always existed, as if the values of the Ten Commandments, the values of a belief, a basic religious belief, were something that all Americans shared, no matter how they prayed and to which God they prayed. This idea that Americans at large were believers in more or less the same fundamental values, this was something that was helping to normalize the position of Jews and Judaism within the American public sphere, so that indeed it would be more accurate to say that the idea that Jews were an unassimilated minority because of their religion, this was something that was beginning to be challenged and even I would say, demolished by the time we get to the early 60s. On the other side, if we're looking at the religious lives of Black Americans, it's very clear from the existence of segregated Black churches that even within the majority religion of the society, segregation was the operative rule, that even within Christian churches, there was a color line. So that on the plane of religion as such, Jews could be said to be making some progress on the road toward fuller integration, becoming on a par with other Americans, even in relation to their religious beliefs and ideas, whereas at the same time, segregation was still the rule in the world of Christian Black people. And so if these two groups, on the one hand, seemed to share certain interests in common, namely, if the country were to be run on the basis of full equality, if all citizens' rights were to be respected, then surely minorities such as Jews and Blacks would be the beneficiaries of that, and that would be seem to be a solid common interest. On the other hand, the two groups did lead very, very different lives in terms of their quality of life, the opportunities to which they had access, and the way in which they were regarded by many of their fellow Americans. And here, I think that we need to ask ourselves, what did Jews, when they looked at this paradoxical situation, on the one hand, the idea that was very much accepted, that Jews and particularly Jewish community organizations ought to voice their opinion in favor of civil rights, equality, and so forth under the law. Was it actually necessary for Jews to push civil rights legislation in order to ensure their own further integration in American society? And I'm going to suggest that it was not necessary. And many Jews realized it. In other words, at some point, and it's hard to pinpoint when, but let's say sometime in the early 1960s, up until 1964, with the passage of the Civil Rights Act, sometime during those early 1960s years, it did dawn on many people in the Jewish community that civil rights legislation was primarily to benefit Black people. It was not something that Jews required for their own needs. Jews' integration could be forwarded to the extent that it still needed to be fulfilled and enhanced. Jews' integration was already in progress. It could be enhanced by greater, the spread of more knowledge about Judaism and Jewish culture, greater interaction between Jews and Christians, between Jewish religious leaders and church leaders, and so on. In other words, at the social level, at the civic level, not at the legislative level. Because, after all, once again, there were no laws on the books anywhere in the United States that limited the rights of Jewish citizens in the way that laws did still limit the status and the opportunities of Black Americans. So civil rights legislation became something in Jewish eyes that they were doing for someone else. And this idea that, well, you know, maybe that interest was an interest that they had in common with other people, but it wasn't an interest that was required, absolutely vital for their own survival, unless one took a very, very principled point of view that said any time that any society makes it possible to discriminate against anyone, that society, by definition, can become insecure, even dangerous for Jews, if not in the present, then in the future. That is to say, Jews having experienced, particularly in Europe, particularly in the wake of the Holocaust, what racial hatred and discrimination actually can do, how destructive and catastrophic it can be in its extreme form, Jews were honor-bound to maintain a very, very low threshold of tolerance for anything like that. If one took a principled point of view that this was something that Jews, as Jews, had their own stake in, then one could carry on maintaining the idea that, yes, civil rights legislation, although Jews as individuals did not need civil rights legislation, American society at large required legislation in order for those norms that were expected to be enshrined in the law, and violations could then be contested. But there is a difference. There's daylight between the very, very abstract, principled position that any inequality of any sort is harmful to Jews per se because they're Jews, between that position and the position that said, yes, it's a good idea to help the Black people since Jews have achieved or are on the way to achieving the kind of equality that Black people should deserve, then Jews ought to help them. But there's a bit of daylight between those positions, and that daylight was going to widen as the years went by for several reasons, as we'll see. Now, I would also suggest that among parts of the civil rights movement from the point of view of Black activists, both individuals and organizations, there was a parallel question about, well, was it a good idea to ally themselves with Jewish activists and with Jewish communal groups? Was it an advantage for the civil rights movement from the Black point of view, or was it a liability to have this sort of Jewish alliance going on? And there were different points of view, just as there could be different points of view in the Jewish community, there were different points of view among Black people as well. And one could find both appreciation, positive appreciation for the cooperation and support being rendered by Jews as individuals and Jewish organizations collectively on behalf of the civil rights movement and progress towards the achievement of desegregation. There was appreciation, but there were points of resentment as well. Part of those resentments were a byproduct of the wide social gap, social and economic and political status gap between black people and Jewish people, as I pointed out earlier. Black people living in inner city neighborhoods sometimes encountered Jewish merchants, shopkeepers, Jewish landlords. Their immediate associations with Jewish people were not always positive. Sometimes they were rather negative. So that could be one source of friction, if you will, or even resentment. But there was an underlying source that I would call more political, and that is something that I'll try to explain very, very briefly, even though it's hard to summarize in a few words. Part of the civil rights phenomenon, the movement as such, as it began to grow, and the voices that began to emerge in Black America from the civil rights movement and the activists around it, some of those voices actually were saying black people should stand up for themselves. It's the role of black people to demand what's coming to them and to take what's coming to them as Americans and as black people with their pride at stake. To be under the tutelage, to be guided, as it were, quote unquote, by white patrons was not exactly the thing that they were after. And this idea that to actually emerge from the era of segregation, the era in which to be a black person in the United States was an absolute liability for life, to emerge from that into an era of actual freedom at the level of one's subjective experience, one's subjective point of view, to emerge into that kind of freedom required freeing oneself from the patronage of white people who already had it better. And again, I want to stress, these were not necessarily attitudes that everyone shared. These were attitudes that were present in parts of the discourse that one could begin to hear in the 60s as we move forward from the early 60s to the mid-60s. These voices of ambivalence and even resentment were there. They were there and people heard them. By the time we get to 1964, the Johnson administration has been pushing for the enactment of civil rights legislation, and it comes indeed to fruition in 1964 with the Civil Rights Act. There's the Voting Rights Act and other parts of the civil rights legislation. This could be seen certainly as a successful culmination of all of the tremendous effort that had been made and the sacrifices and the struggles that had been made since the 1940s and 50s onward. And there was the possibility of saying, yes, we've succeeded, that with the signing of the Civil Rights Act, equality under the law was assured, violations could be contested in the courts, and from now on, we no longer had to engage in that same struggle. And yet by the very same act of signing these legislations into law, it opened the book on a new page, on the page that started with the heading, "What does this not solve?" And clearly what it didn't solve was the question of social equality, economic equality. equality of opportunity and equality of outcome. In other words, America remained a very divided country in many, many ways, as it remains today, a very divided country. And legislation was not going to change that. And as the civil rights movement morphs beyond 1964 into something new, into a movement that continues to see itself in struggle to find its way toward the fulfillment of what the legislation of civil rights equality was meant to start, but not finish. That movement moved into areas in which the wide gap between black people and Jewish people by any socioeconomic measure, that was going to come more and more to the fore. And I will just say it once more. Jews, by very large majorities, said that they favored civil rights legislation. They said that they favored basic equality among all Americans, regardless of race, creed, color, and so forth. Once you get that settled, the area for agreement is going to narrow because people are going to act more and more on their socioeconomic interests and less on the platform of, are there laws that still need to be changed? The laws had changed. And what happened next, as we know, if we move, let's say, symbolically speaking, from 1963 to 1968, with the figure of Martin Luther King Jr. at the pinnacle of his public influence and public status in '63 at the March on Washington, to his assassination in 1968, and the changes that come over not only the civil rights movement or the movements that become associated with black people's rights, demands, ambitions, and so forth. Between the mid-'60s and the late '60s, something very drastic is going to happen on the ground in America, not only in the civil rights movement itself, but in the majority society, in white America. Things were going to come to a head, to a more radical place than had been the case a decade before. The outward manifestation of this radicalization is coming to a boiling point of all of the pressures that had been unresolved by the Civil Rights Act. The most visible and the most talked about manifestation were the riots that took place in most American cities across the country between 1964 and 1968. From the East Coast to the West Coast, to points in between, Philadelphia, Newark, Los Angeles, Detroit. Cities were burning every summer. The picture that you see on the screen is from the appointment in July of 1967 of a special presidential commission, the Kerner Commission, charged with looking into the causes and possible remedies for these major civil disorders that had been roiling the country for several years running. And it was very, very clear that outbreaks of violence of this sort, rioting, looting, burning of inner city areas, that this was something that was the new agenda and had not been resolved by legislation or by the heroic struggle for legal equality. Beyond legal equality lay a whole new horizon. And it's at this stage, once again, that the beneficiaries of equality legislation were not necessarily the beneficiaries of social equality. And if you were already enjoying a higher social status in the country, you had more to lose during this radicalization of urban violence, civil discord, and so forth. And it's that point at which this Black-Jewish alliance begins to fray. The administration, it should be said, obviously also has other fish to fry. We're in the mid-1960s. We're already in the era of Vietnam. The Johnson administration is pushing its Great Society programs, its war on poverty. The idea was to begin to address some of the underlying issues of social and economic inequality bedeviling American society. And the idea that the American social framework, the vision that actually goes back to the New Deal, to FDR, to the idea of a large coalition of the have-nots who could push the country forward under the leadership of the Democratic Party. This was something that the administration was very heavily invested in. And it's one of the reasons that it began to look at the economics rather than the politics of race as the most pressing issue. And here, many Jewish people could agree that economic progress, economic liberalization, a better welfare state, better opportunities in employment and education were a very good thing. Whereas the people who were becoming more and more radicalized in the Black community, who had graduated from the civil rights movement and were now looking at a reality which did not suit the ambitions that they had had before desegregation had been signed into law. That radicalized wing of the Black movement no longer agreed that the way forward was more of the same, more palliative measures aimed at incremental benefits programs. The idea that one could use the tools of government for policy programs, voting, desegregation legislation, reliance on the courts, all of that idea that the government was really the place to push for social change, that confidence is what was being lost. The confidence that one could pursue major social and political policy change through the avenues of government, through an integrated effort of large coalitions. This is what people were no longer being quite as confident about, particularly those on the radical wing of the Black movement. It would be fair to say that most of the Jewish establishment organizations that had been very, very involved in the civil rights movement in the 50s and early 60s carried on with the ideology that they had had since the 30s and 40s, since the New Deal coalition, that government was the answer, that working together in large coalitions was the answer. They had confidence in the laws, they had confidence in the power structure. They were, in fact, working in the terms of what radicals called the establishment. They were part of the establishment rather than anti-establishment. Now, I say they in a very, very general way, always bearing in mind that there were lots of Jewish people who did not agree, but they tended to be individuals. They tended to be students. They tended to be people who were politically radicalized themselves. They were speaking in more radical terms as Jews, alongside other radicalized people in American society about what really needed to be changed in American society, and that could not be changed by passing laws or by going to court or by trying to change the government. These were people coming out of what came to be known as the counterculture. In other words, we no longer trust society's institutions to do the right thing, to create change, to make the conditions for change possible. That, in fact, what needed to be done was a radical rejection of what the entire establishment had been proposing and propounding for the previous 30 or 40 years. And this idea that the real issues went beyond the capacity of normal government measures, normal legal measures, and applications to the court and that sort of thing. A previous generation had been willing to place its confidence in the social and political institutions of the country in order to win something better. The younger generation increasingly, and again, I'm using generalizations, I do so with a grain of salt, and nevertheless, let's put it on the table. There were causes that were being proclaimed by the late 60s that had very little to do with the values that had animated the old Black-Jewish alliance. And they were issues on which people would split. The issues included what was known then as women's liberation, what we refer to today more often as feminism, the second wave. We're talking about directly addressing questions of social inequality and how it was not amenable to legislative change. We're talking about youth culture as a phenomenon that was no longer willing to accept being groomed for middle-class respectability. We're talking about massive opposition and resistance to the Vietnam War. We're talking about lifestyle alternatives, and we're talking about the question of identity. And I'll be talking more about identity next week, but let me just point out for the present that identity was the place where the subjective I, the subjective person, was demanding to be empowered to defend and to define their own space, their own way of life, their own way of thinking. And when identity or culture or subjectivity comes into play, where one lived, where one stood on other issues, became one's calling card in society. It was no longer about forging alliances, it was about being you. And here, on this rock of identity politics, the Black-Jewish alliance finally was going to falter. There were other reasons, and one of them has to do with different approaches to how do you amend social inequality? Can you do it simply by allowing equality under the law to take its course? Or do you do it by reverse discrimination, or what was called affirmative action? Most of the Jewish communal groups in the United States said they were in favor of some form of affirmative action, but they were against the practice of maintaining specific quotas to be achieved by employers or universities and so on. And here, these differences of interests, these differences of status position were coming to the fore in a new way. They were all going to contribute to this coming apart, as I say, this fraying of what had been viewed as a natural alliance between Black people and Jewish people in the new terms of the politics of the late 1960s. Such alliances no longer seemed quite as taken for granted as might have been the case a decade before. Such alliances were now being contested from within the Black community and from within the Jewish community, and other issues were going to become paramount. And these are the processes, as I say, that we'll try to address a little bit more next week. Thank you for listening. And if there are questions that have been sent along in the chat to Tamar, perhaps we have some 10 minutes or so to try and address them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eli. So we have some questions and comments. I'm actually going to begin with some of the later questions because I think some of the questions at the beginning you might have answered as we went along. So did other minority groups like Puerto Ricans move faster up the social ladder than the Blacks? Could you explain why that happened?
All right, well, let me expand the question a little bit. The idea that in the United States one can separate a Hispanic population and call it that is, of course, it doesn't hold water. There are different groups, just as there are always different groups. Mexican Americans, Puerto Rican Americans, other Hispanic Americans, people who immigrate from Latin America, particularly after the new immigration laws of 1964 made it pretty much completely open and free for Latin Americans to immigrate to the United States. These created a very, very large Hispanic group of populations in the United States. Some of them visibly did better than others. Cubans, for example, who left Castro's Cuba after 1959, visibly did well socially and economically, whereas Mexican Americans tended to be much slower on average in terms of where they were at a decade after their immigration. Puerto Rican groups in American cities tend to fall somewhere in between. I don't think that it's the case that, looking at Puerto Ricans specifically, I don't think that it's demonstrably the case that Puerto Ricans as a whole or on average did much, much better than Black Americans. I think that would have to be very, very carefully parsed with good research documentation. Clearly there was an up-and-coming Puerto Rican middle class and commercial class, just as there was an up-and-coming professional and middle class of entrepreneurs in the Black community. So we have to be very careful about where we say, who was better off, who was faster, and so on. I would say, let's hold that in abeyance for now and say, actually, all of the quote-unquote non-white minorities were making a certain amount of progress on the socioeconomic front, but they were demonstrably well under the national average for white people. And Jews, on the other hand, were well above the national average. And that's where this sort of gap that I'm talking about has to be seen as creating a new perception that actually these two groups may not share as many common interests as we thought.
Okay. Before you spoke about the civil rights laws, and the question is, are these laws being used today by Jews as a bulwark against anti-Semitism?
That's a very good question, and they're beginning this idea that civil rights provisions should protect everyone under all circumstances and can be used in order to challenge in the courts and in other ways to challenge university administrations, to bring suit against corporations or organizations or universities which can be accused of ignoring or downplaying the basic civil rights of anyone, be they Jews or Asian Americans or Muslim Americans or anybody. That idea was already in play over the last 5 or 10 years. It's become increasingly more relevant, as you all know, over the last 3 or 4 years. And certainly now, since October 7th, I anticipate there will be more and more civil suits brought under the civil rights provisions of the law, with the argument that indeed the civil rights of Jewish students on campuses, for example, have been ignored, neglected, downplayed, or violated.
Could you explain what caused the JDL to begin fighting Black anti-Semitism?
Oh, that's another good question. Well, I spoke earlier about radicalization, and I did mention the radicalization that took place among parts of the Black movement. I'll speak more specifically next time about the Black Power movement, which was essentially an outgrowth of this radicalization. One of the spin-offs of the Black Power movement was the idea that, well, actually, people who want to position themselves with more power in society should do so. White power became strengthened because of Black Power, or in the wake of Black Power. And the Jewish Defense League was another spin-off, a radical, very small, but very radical Jewish group that said, well, there should be Jewish power. And Jewish power, first of all, should be deployed in the streets of American cities where it was perceived that Jews were being subjected to street violence, vandalism of their shops, and so on during these civil disorders that I mentioned earlier, particularly in the summer months during the years between 64 and 68, and beyond in some cases. This idea that Jews need to defend their rights in the streets and not in the courts. This is very much in keeping with this identity politics and taking the politics away from courts, governments, legislation, and putting it in the street. And this is very much an aspect of what, in very broad terms, one can call counterculture. The difference, however, in the case of the JDL, the Jewish Defense League, is that very, very quickly the JDL ran aground against a major wellspring of Jewish opposition to the JDL. The Jewish community at large, all of its organizations, all of its spokespeople spoke out very strongly against any sort of violence in the streets, be it against Black people, be it against, even in the struggle on behalf of Soviet Jewry, which is something I'll touch on next week. The idea that the JDL people had was that one should deploy violence against Soviet diplomatic offices and that sort of thing. Most of the overwhelming majority of the Jewish community in the United States rejected that point of view. And so the JDL never actually got off the ground in that sense. And I would say that compared to the Black Power movement, which did get off the ground, the Jewish Power movement remained in embryo.
Okay. I think the last question was also about a topic a little earlier in the talk. What about gentlemen agreements that the courts outlawed?
Okay, so if we're talking about the clauses included in, let's say, real estate contracts, what were known as covenants, where homeowners signed, white homeowners, were routinely asked to sign documents that if they sell their property, they would not be selling to Black property buyers. That sort of agreement known, quote unquote, as covenants, or if you will, gentleman's agreement. They were not gentlemanly at all. But the point is that this idea that discrimination was okay if it was in the private sector. That is what the civil rights legislation actually dealt a death blow to. The idea that discrimination was okay as long as you were doing it on your own private property. That was dealt a very, very severe blow. And of course, there were many, many court cases that came up in the wake of the legislation of anti-discrimination that made it possible to put an end eventually to this kind of behind the scenes or gentlemanly tacit agreements to try and block black people from moving into certain neighborhoods, blocking mortgage loans from banks in certain areas and allowing them only in other areas. All of that is something that legislation, the legislation of the mid-60s made it possible to challenge and indeed do away with in the years that followed.
Okay. We will take one last question for Tzvi, who's been asking a few questions. Could you relate to Black violence against Jews who lived in Black neighborhoods?
I will do so next week.
Okay, so Tzvi, I hope you join us next week. And thank you very much, Eli, and thank you everyone for joining us. And we will be continuing. Thank you.